I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. It's the morning of June 27th, 1844. Emma Smith awoke to the sound of kids running through the house and doing children things. She's 5 months pregnant and she needs her rest, but it was a night of tossing and turning. There are too many unknowns. Her husband and brother-in-law are interred in Carthage jail. Intelligence is constantly working its way into Nauvoo about the nearby cities gearing up for war. The Nauvoo Legion has been disbanded and disarmed, but that's officially. Unofficially, the Legion is ready to go at a moment's notice, whether to defend the city, to break their supreme leader out of jail, or to loot and pillage local non-Mormon villages. Joseph had wanted Emma to leave town with the kids. He wanted them to either head to Washington, D.C., where Emma would meet with President John Tyler and tell him the plight of her husband and the Mormons at large, or to begin the journey west, where the Saints would follow close behind. Emma knew that she was a target as Joe's publicly known wife, and being pregnant only complicated matters further. Plans were rushing in and out of her mind. If everything blew up, she'd need an escape plan to keep her and the kids safe while her husband, worked out his escape plan. It had happened in Missouri. It happened in Dixon, Illinois last year. And the time seemed to be approaching that Emma would have to handle her family and the church in her husband's absence until he could extricate himself from his present difficulties. Her words to the prophet ring deep, and they provide a window into Emma's headspace and her mind at this troubling time during yet another hard pregnancy. Quote, I desire prudence, that I may not through ambition abuse my body and cause it to become prematurely old and careworn, but that I may wear a cheerful countenance, live to perform all the work that I covenanted to perform in the spirit world, and be a blessing to all who may in any wise need aught at my hands. I desire with all my heart to honor and respect my husband as my head, ever to live in his confidence, and by acting in unison with him, retained the place which God has given me by his side. And I ask my heavenly Father that through humility I may be enabled to overcome that curse which was pronounced upon the daughters of Eve. I desire to see that I may rejoice with them in the blessings which God has in store for all who are willing to be obedient to his requirements. Finally, I desire that whatever may be my lot through life, I may be enabled to acknowledge the hand of God in all things. End quote. There were too many unknowns. All Emma could do was resign herself to a power she thought to be in control of everything. In her mind, whatever happened in that jail would be the plan and will of God. She could only operate with whatever information she had, which was scarce and delayed. In Carthage, Joseph Smith woke up with John S. Fulmer's head on his right arm and Dan Jones's head on his left arm. He probably used a coat or something for his own pillow on the hard wooden floor. John Taylor, Willard Richards, Stephen Markham, and Hyrum Smith awoke from the bed as the sun broke through the window. It was to be a very busy day. The men in the jail briefly spoke with Double Dub Phelps and Nauvoo's city marshal, John P. Green, who had executed the mayor's orders to burn the Nauvoo Expositor printing press, which kind of caused this whole thing to begin with. We don't know what information was exchanged as these men passed, presumably from Yell Room to Nauvoo, and stopped in Carthage for just a few minutes at 5 a.m. The prisoners then took breakfast at 7 a.m. with a Mr. Crane, whose identity is unknown. Apparently he had a question for the prophet, quote, Mr. Crane at breakfast with us wanted to know if Joseph fainted 3 times on Tuesday, reviewing the troops as currently reported, end quote. Did Joseph Smith faint 3 times while Governor Ford was showing him to the militias in Carthage? It's quite an odd artifact to find in Whiteout Willard Richards' contemporary journal, and that's the only place that you find this mentioned. Maybe Joe was intimidated, overwhelmed, underslept, overstressed, strung out from whatever the doctor was giving him, and underfed that caused him to faint 3 times. Joe had had a conversation with Governor Ford the previous day. Governor Ford was leaving for Nauvoo this morning, and Joe would accompany him to the Mormon stronghold of Nauvoo so that Governor Ford could better understand the situation from the perspective of the Mormon citizens there. When a state is teetering on the edge of civil war, there are many angles to consider. Ford wanted to balance what he was hearing from all of the anti-Mormons with some interviews of the Mormons in Nauvoo. How can the executive of state make good decisions when he's being fed sporadic and unverifiable information by people who just want to kill every Mormon they see? He didn't know who he could trust. Governor Ford knew that whatever happened in Nauvoo would be reflected in the other Mormon settlements nearby, as the people would follow their prophet no matter what. If Ford could get the prophet and the Mormons on his side, or even warn them of the danger that they were in, he could negotiate the tensions of this brewing civil war from a place of advantage. One of the Mormon settlements outside of Nauvoo that had come under intense pressure was Yelrum. The morning of June 27th, 1844, for Leonora Snow was a stressful one. Some men claiming to be operating under the color of militia law had approached the Mormons in Yelrum and given them a 24-hour ultimatum: help us arrest your prophet or give up your guns. But Joe had sent a letter telling the Yelrum Mormons to basically keep him informed on what is going on, and that he needed them there in Yelrum as a strategic advantage. You see, once the militias closed in on Nauvoo, the Mormons in Yelrum and Ramus and Macedonia and all of these other satellite Mormon settlements, they presented the best opportunity to provide an assault on the flanks of those besieging Illinois armies. All things considered, tensions were high in Yelrum, and Leonora Snow and her husband Isaac Morley, along with the hundreds of others living there, would be feeling these tensions the morning of June 27th when they awoke at daybreak. Leonora didn't know if those militiamen, Misters Banks and Baker, would return and force the citizens out of their homes in Yelrum to consolidate the Mormons into Nauvoo. She didn't know the whereabouts of her sister, Eliza R. Snow, nor when her brother, Lorenzo Snow, would return from his mission in Ohio. Eliza R. Snow had been living with her sister, Leonora, and her brother-in-law, Isaac Morley, in Yelrum until April 1844, which is when Eliza Snow moved in with Hannah and Stephen Markham in Nauvoo. Eliza left her sister Leonora to live with Isaac Morley and Leonora's sister wives, understanding Isaac was a good man who dearly cared for all of his wives. Eliza was happy to be living back in Nauvoo close to her husband Joseph. Leonora and Eliza, the sisters Snow, were separated by the hotbeds of anti-Mormonism: Warsaw, Illinois, where Thomas Sharp's Warsaw Signal was published, and Carthage, where the prophet was in jail and Governor Ford was encamped with the militias. The sisters Snow would have had very different pressures stemming from the same tension upon waking up on this day. Leonora, of course, would have wondered when the state militia would march into Yelrum and remove the Mormons from their homes. Eliza would have wondered what would happen once Nauvoo was surrounded by state militias, as all signals seemed to indicate that this maneuver was imminent. Governor Ford was well aware of all of this, and Ford was hearing crying from all over the state, telling him to simply exterminate the Mormons, as Governor Lilburn Boggs had done in Missouri. As he organized his posse to travel to Nauvoo on the morning of June 27th, he weighed in the balance how effective his companies of militia would be with guarding the jail in Carthage. He disbanded all of the state militias. That was well over 1,300 men, which had gathered in Carthage and Warsaw with the understanding that it would illustrate to the citizens of Illinois that the situation was all under control. The governor is here. Just let him handle it. He resolved to take a guard with him to Nauvoo and leave the Carthage Greys in their own city to board at their own homes while guarding the Mormon leadership in Carthage jail. Governor Ford writes in retrospect in his History of Illinois circa 1852, quote, What gave me greater confidence in the selection of the Carthage company as a prudent measure was that the selection was first suggested and urged by the Brigadier General in command, Deming, who was well known to be utterly hostile to all mobocracy and violence towards the prisoners, and who was openly charged by the violent party with being on the side of the Mormons. At any rate, I knew that the jail would have to be guarded as long as the prisoners were confined, that an imprisonment for treason might last the whole summer and the greater part of autumn before a trial could be had in the circuit court, that it would be utterly impossible in the circumstances of the country to keep a force there from a foreign county for so long a time, and that a time must surely come when the duty of guarding the jail would necessarily devolve on the citizens of the county. It is true also that at this time I had not believed or suspected that any attack was to be made upon the prisoners in the jail. It is true that I was aware that a great deal of hatred existed against them, and that there were those who would do them an injury if they could. I had heard of some threats being made, but none of an attack upon the prisoners whilst in jail. These threats seemed to be made by individuals not acting in concert. They were no more than the bluster which might have been expected, and furnished no indication of numbers combining for this or any other purpose." End quote. We're going to talk about that point in a moment here, because a lot of people were warning Governor Ford that an assassination attempt was in the works. But all of those people were sycophants of the prophet, who Governor Ford generally distrusted for good reasons to begin with. He also distrusted a lot of the citizens who hated the Mormons. He was a smart guy, and he was inherently skeptical. Continuing on, quote, "I must here be permitted to say also that frequent appeals had been made to me to make a clean and thorough work of the matter, by exterminating the Mormons or expelling them from the state. An opinion seemed generally to prevail that the sanction of executive authority would legalize the act, and all persons of any influence, authority, or note who conversed with me on the subject frequently and repeatedly stated their total unwillingness to act without my direction, or in any mode except according to law. This was a circumstance well calculated to conceal from me the secret machinations on foot. I had constantly contended against violent measures, and so had the Brigadier General in command, Deming, and I am convinced that unusual pains were taken to conceal from both of us the secret measures resolved upon. It has been said, however, that some person named Levi Williams, in a public speech at Carthage, called for volunteers to murder the Smiths, and that I ought to have had him arrested. Whether such a speech was really made or not is yet unknown to me." End quote. So Governor Ford had some leverage calculated in leaving Brigadier General Deming in charge of the Carthage Greys who were guarding the jail. Ford knew how high the tensions were, and that this guy, Brigadier General Deming, had his head on straight. Any non-Mormon militia officer who was being charged by the other violent men as a friend of the Mormons, that was going to be a good pick to oversee the guard operations in town. But there was more to this calculation, because if any attack happened on the prisoners in Carthage while Governor Ford was in Nauvoo, his life would be in danger. He feared the immediate Mormon retaliation should anything happen to the prophet, which he considered his own life being in danger enough insurance against any attack on the Mormon leadership in Carthage jail. If Joe was hurt, the Mormons would wreak vengeance on the entire Hancock County, beginning with the governor himself. He thought that nobody in his command would be so cavalier and stupid as to make such an attack with so many lives held in the balance. The prophet dying in Carthage, guarded by the Carthage militia, would ensure the Mormon vengeance campaign would begin with the citizens of Carthage. And they would never be so stupid as to put their own properties, their own lives, and their own families in danger by allowing harm to come upon the prophet while in their care under Brigadier General Deming's supervision, who the violent citizens had, charged with being a Mormon sympathizer. Governor Ford had told Joe the previous day that Joe was going to accompany the governor and his dragoons for their trip to Nauvoo. However, Ford decided that that was an ill-advised decision, as he'd be unable to ensure the prophet's return to Carthage as soon as they entered Joe's little fiefdom in Nauvoo, and Ford's men became subject to the whims of the now officially disbanded Nauvoo Legion following the word of their supreme leader, Joseph Smith. Joseph wrote a letter to his wife, Emma, telling her of this situation that was going on, all of the machinations, everything that was going on during the early planning phases on the morning of June 27th here. And he was also assuring her that all is well and instructing her to receive the governor and his men once Joe had been told what was going on. And understandably, with tensions so high and a platoon led by Governor Ford marching into Nauvoo, that would be treated with hostility by the Mormons. Joe wanted to make sure Emma knew their arrival was no cause for alarm and not to bring out the Legion to oppose the governor entering the city. So the body of the letter that we're going to read here is written by Whiteout Willard Richards with a small postscript that's written by the prophet himself. It was also drafted early in the morning in preparation for sending out with that early morning's mails, but it was revised as the prisoners received more information and when Joe learned that he would not be accompanying the governor for his trip to Nauvoo. Quote, Dear Emma, the governor continues his courtesies and permits us to see our friends. We hear this morning that the governor will not go down with his troops today to Nauvoo, as was anticipated last evening, but if he does come down with his troops today, you will be protected, and I want you to tell Brother Jonathan Dunham, that's a commanding officer of the Nauvoo Legion, to instruct the people to stay at home and attend to their own business, and let there be no groups of gathering together unless by permission of the governor. They are called together to receive communications from the governor, which would please our people. But let the governor direct. Brother Dunham, of course, will obey the orders of the government officers and render them the assistance they require. The wording of this letter, Joseph Smith had clearly been won over by Governor Ford. Clearly, he trusted Governor Ford to have Joe's best interest in mind and the best interest of the Mormons in mind here. Otherwise, he never would have written this letter this way. He says, There is no dangers of any exterminating order. Should there be a meeting among the troops, which we do not anticipate excitement is abating, a part will remain loyal and stand for the defense of the state and our rights. There is one principle which is eternal. It is the duty of all men to protect their lives and the lives of their household whenever necessity requires, and no power has a right to forbid it. Should the last extreme arrive, but I anticipate no such extreme, but caution is the parent of safety. Signed, Joseph Smith. First postscript. Dear Emma, I am very much resigned to my lot, knowing I am justified and have done the best that could be done. Give my love to the children and all my friends, Mr. Brower and all who inquire after me. And as for treason, I know that I have not committed any, and they cannot prove one appearance of anything of the kind. So ye need not have any fears that any harm can happen to us on that score. May God bless you all. Amen. Signed, Joseph Smith. Second postscript. This is added with the addendum 20 minutes to 10. I just learned that the governor is about to disband his troops, all but a guard to protect us and the peace, and come himself to Nauvoo and deliver a speech to the people. This is right, as I suppose. End quote. So that final postscript that was added 20 minutes to 10 a.m., a messenger named Joel S. Miles put that letter in his pocket and set out for Nauvoo ahead of the governor's posse in order to deliver that crucial message to Emma before they arrived, in hopes that nobody would assemble and treat the governor and his posse with hostility. If Miles was unable to reach Nauvoo before the governor and the dragoons, who knows how the Mormon leadership there would react to the governor and his troops riding into the theocratic kingdom. And there's a point worth mentioning here. Joe and the other men locked in Carthage jail weren't your regular prisoners. Prisoners locked in jail on horse theft charges, disorderly conduct, breaching the peace, counterfeit, lower-level crimes. They'd be locked in jail without any access to people from the outside. Now, they may be allowed to see legal counsel or maybe send and receive letters, but their liberty for those lower-level crimes is completely restricted. However, for high-level, white-collar, political or military crimes, those same restrictions rarely take place. Joe and his buddies were allowed messengers by special permission from Governor Ford, and these messengers could enter and exit the jail apartments at will. The jail itself wasn't actually what we usually understand a jail to be either. The men spent only a short amount of time in an actual cell with bars on the windows and the door, but that was just like for a few hours. The majority of the time that they spent was in the upstairs apartment, known as the debtor's apartment, with windows that could open wide enough to fit a man through, and messengers could carry letters in and out of that apartment as they pleased. The men allowed special permissions were Stephen Markham, the same family that Eliza Arsenault was living with at the time in Nauvoo, Dan Jones, the Mississippi ferry owner and a Danite who had lots of little birds all over the county that funneled information to the prophet through Dan Jones. We also have Joel S. Miles, a Nauvoo Legionnaire who served as a courier. We have John S. Fulmer, another Nauvoo Legionnaire and personal Danite bodyguard of the prophet. Then we have Hugh T. Reed and James Woods, two non-Mormon attorneys for the prophet in the coming legal fight. And also, finally, Cyrus Wheelock, another messenger. As long as Governor Ford was in town, the jailer, George Stegall, would honor the passes of all of these men to enter and exit the Carthage apartments as necessary in order to visit the prophet and the prisoners. There was basically an air of gentlemanly trust among these men that anything brought to or removed from the jail wasn't anything that was going to alter the circumstances. The letters sent and received don't seem to have been screened, and the men weren't really searched for any kind of contraband, or if they were, the search wasn't very thorough. That's because it wasn't the bars on the window or even the jailer, George Stegall, who was keeping the prisoners there and stopping them from trying to break out. It was the entire militia outside and the risk assessment for attempting to escape. I mean, just consider this. 4 guys in a jail in a very hostile town with an entire militia encamped inside that town. How would they escape? What was the plan once they were outside the jail? I mean, what would stop the militia from shooting them as soon as they stepped foot outside of the Carthage jail building? I mean, everybody valued their own lives way too much to attempt anything so stupid, and nothing that entered or left the jail was expected to change that risk assessment. It was the situation that kept them in the jail, not the bars. As Governor Ford was getting ready to leave for Nauvoo, John S. Fulmer planned on taking an initial round of communications with him to Nauvoo. Most of them were verbal communications. According to Fulmer himself, in a letter to George A. Smith while working on the History of the Church project in 1854, Fulmer, quote, left for Nauvoo with instructions from Joseph and Hyrum to aid in hunting up and forwarding witnesses to Carthage, end quote. As these men were expecting their trial in 2 days on Saturday, June 29th, they wanted to prepare a slate of witnesses with a solid and cohesive story to defend the prophet and get him released on the charges of riot and treason. Also to probably destroy or to move the counterfeit printing press that was operating in the city, although the evidence for that whole thing is really tough to nail down. So sometime in the 3-hour period between waking up on Joe's right arm and leaving around 8 a.m., John S. Fulmer removed a single-shot pistol from his frock and handed it to Joseph Smith. What was the plan with this gun? John Fulmer didn't seem to provide any extra powder or balls with the gun. It was good for 1 shot if the powder remained dry. Would Joe fight off the entire Carthage Gray militia with 1 shot from 1 pistol? Maybe that pistol was just for himself, should the situation turn really sour. We can't know. All we do know is that John S. Fulmer passed this single-shot pistol to Joseph Smith, who accepted the pistol and then hid it in his coat. Now, he may have told the other prisoners about this pistol, or he may have kept it to himself. John S. Fulmer left with instructions to gather witnesses about an hour ahead of Governor Ford's posse of dragoons. And as Ford continued to gather his men for the trip to Nauvoo, Dan Jones, who had woken up on the left arm of the prophet, left the jail cell in order to procure a private pass for Willard Richards and for himself to come and go from the Carthage jail as they pleased. The experience of Dan Jones here is quite interesting, and Jones had heard of the conspiracy afoot in Carthage to murder the prisoners as he was headed to meet the governor and try and acquire this Carthage jail pass. This exchange is reported in the history of the church. Quote, "While Dan Jones was going to Governor Ford's quarters, he saw an assemblage of men, and heard one of them, who was apparently a leader, making a speech, saying that our troops will be discharged this morning in obedience to orders, and for a sham we will leave the town. But when the governor and the MacDonough troops have left for Nauvoo this afternoon, we will return and kill those men if we have to tear down the jail." The sentiment was applauded by 3 cheers from the crowd. Captain Dan Jones went to the governor, told him what had occurred in the night, what the officer of the guard had said, and what he had heard while coming to see him, and earnestly solicited him to avert the danger. His Excellency replied, "You are unnecessarily alarmed for the safety of your friends, sir. The people are not that cruel." Irritated by such a remark, Jones urged the necessity of placing better men to guard them than professed assassins, and said, "The Mr. Smith are American citizens, and have surrendered themselves to your Excellency upon your pledging your honor for their safety. They are also master masons, and as such I demand of you protection of their lives." Governor Ford's face turned pale, and Jones remarked, "If you do not do this, I have but one more desire, and that is, if you leave their lives in the hands of those men to be sacrificed." And there's a pause. "What is that, sir?" he asked in a hurried tone. "It is," said Jones, "that the Almighty will preserve my life to a proper time and place, that I may testify that you have been timely warned of their danger." Jones then returned to the prison, but the guard would not let him enter. He again returned to the hotel and found Governor Ford standing in front of the MacDonough troops, who were in line ready to escort him to Nauvoo. The disbanded mob retired to the rear, shouting loudly they were only going a short distance out of town, when they would return and kill old Joe and Hyrum as soon as the governor was far enough out of town. Jones called the attention of the governor to the threats then made, but he took no notice of them, although it was impossible for him to avoid hearing them. While obtaining this jail pass, Jones's life was threatened, and Chauncey L. Higbee, one of the publishers of the Nauvoo Expositor, Chauncey L. Higbee said to him in the street, "We are determined to kill Joe and Hyrum, and you had better go away and save yourself." End quote. So just a few points to mention in this account of Dan Jones's experience meeting with the governor, hearing these people conspiring on the street to wait for Ford to leave town, and they were going to kill him. This was written after the fact, so conversations could be fabricated, or they could be falsely remembered to tell basically any narrative that the historians wanted to tell. Notably as well, this is a day that was very emotionally charged. A lot of very complicated emotions were going on for anybody who was connected with this day on either side of the conflict. So memory can be a very fickle thing when it's attached to very strong emotions like this. For these reasons, that casts this entire account from Dan Jones into question. But I believe that the core point is accurate. Dan Jones was one voice which warned the governor that there was a conspiracy to assassinate the men as soon as he left town. Dan Jones was a pretty unremarkable dude, and he was not well known outside of Nauvoo. He could have eavesdropped on any number of conversations and, small little public, speeches, and he could have gathered all sorts of intel. Dan Jones, that was his specialty. He was the Nauvoo Varys, if you're a Game of Thrones watcher. Gathering information from his little birds around town was his forte. That was his commodity. That was his value to the prophet, which made him the best ferry captain in town. He was privy to all sorts of conversations that other people weren't, and then he funneled all of that intel back to the prophet. However, if the conspirators were this vocal about this whole plot to assassinate the prophet in the presence of Governor Ford would never have left town. The absolute last place that Governor Ford would want to be when these people successfully completed this plot to murder the prophet was Nauvoo. Because Governor Ford knew that the Mormons would instantly retaliate once they learned that the prophet was slain. If Ford really believed that the prisoners would be murdered as soon as he left Carthage, Nauvoo is the last place that he would go. We're going to talk more on that point in just a few minutes here. So Dan Jones, after this conversation with Governor Ford, he returned to the jail with a pass for Whiteout Willard Richards, but he was denied his own pass. So the pass for Dr. Richards reads, quote, "You are to permit Dr. Richards, the private secretary of Joseph Smith, to be with him if he desires it, and to pass and repass the guard," end quote. Now, Willard Richards, that dude wasn't charged with the crimes. He was in Carthage jail with Hiram, Joe, and John Taylor of his own volition. He now had a pass to enter and exit the jail freely. Dan Jones, however, would not be granted that same access again after having spent the previous night in the jail sleeping on Joe's left arm. Dan Jones remained in Carthage for a little bit longer to serve as yet another message courier. As Jones was leaving the jail, after he gave the pass to Whiteout Willard Richards that was, signed by the governor, another man entered the jail with a private pass to see the prisoners. This man was named Cyrus Wheelock. He stopped in to take some verbal messages from the prophet and possibly to convey verbal messages from Nauvoo to the prophet and the patriarch. Although, these are verbal messages. We don't know what conversations these men were having here. Cyrus Wheelock had in his jacket a small pistol as well. This pistol wasn't a single shot like John S. Fulmer had given to Joseph Smith. This was what was known as a pepperbox pistol. Revolvers had yet to become very popular at this time in the early and mid 1840s because they were such a recent invention. What preceded the revolver were pepperbox pistols. They're notoriously unreliable and they're nearly impossible to aim because they're smoothbore. These pistols have individual barrels for each individual shot, as opposed to a cylinder that revolves and then charges and fires each round through the same barrel. This pistol that Joseph had, that Cyrus Wheelock gave to Joseph here, was a 6-shooter pepperbox pistol, having 6 individual barrels, each loaded with a charge and a cap. Each time that a person pulls the trigger, it rotates all of the barrels. It cycles all of the barrels, allowing the user to fire 6 individual shots. Now, a patent was filed in 1837 by an inventor named Ethan Allen, which Joe quoted in his letter to the Green Mountain Boys, and that kicked off the popularity of these guns. Eventually, the Allen and Thurber pepperbox pistols, manufactured in Connecticut and a few other places, they became a mainstay and a very popular pistol, selling for like $10 at the time. Allen and Thurber actually never marketed these pepperbox pistols to the military. These were strictly civilian personal defense guns with no sights and smoothbore barrels. Often, especially the early versions of the pepperbox pistols, when the cap on one of the barrels would detonate from the hammer, the spark would jump to one of the other barrels and it would discharge multiple shots. It was, called a chain shot. One firing barrel would set off the next barrel, the next barrel, the next barrel, which means that you could get, with one pull of the trigger, you get 2, 3, 4, 6 shots, all with a delay of just a few milliseconds. And that only added to the difficulty of aiming these guns. They're useless for attempting to shoot a target that's further than, 5 meters away. But in a crowded area or point blank range, pepperbox pistols are incredibly effective. It's what gamers and jarheads like to call spray and pray. These gave shooters the ability to fire 6 shots in a very short time instead of single-shot pistols like most that dominated the market prior to the late 1830s. Cyrus Wheelock removed this pepperbox pistol from his coat and he handed it to Joseph. And at this point, Joe tried to give the pistol back to Cyrus, saying that he might need it for personal protection. But Cyrus Wheelock declined, and Joe went over to his coat where he had stashed the single-shot pistol that was given to him from John S. Fulmer. And he pulled this single-shot pistol out, and he handed it to his brother, Hyrum sidekick Abiff Smith, saying, quote, "You may have use for this." Hiram's reply to that? "I hate to use such things, or to see them used." "So do I," said Joseph, "but we may have to defend ourselves," end quote. So Hyrum took the single-shot pistol from his younger brother and placed it in his pants pockets. And Joe did the same with Wheelock's pepperbox 6-shot pistol. A little anecdote that you might find, amusing, I guess. The last time that I visited Nauvoo, I was lucky enough to get a tour of Carthage and Nauvoo from an incredible researcher who tends to be very reclusive but knows more about Nauvoo than entire teams employed by the church. With this tour guide, a number of historian friends and I attended the Carthage tour that's provided by missionaries who, they tell the story by what they memorized from the church's pamphlet. As the elderly missionary told the story of Carthage, these historians essentially used the missionaries' talking points from a pamphlet as cues to discuss the history behind the story that the missionary was telling us. And as they talked, the missionary, it was kind of funny, the missionary became quieter and quieter, eventually realizing that there was nothing that he was going to tell any of us, that we didn't know way more about him than he did. So the tour finished, and we all walked back down the stairs from the upstairs apartment where the shootout occurred and into the small courtyard below the window, the infamous window. And we discussed the various accounts of what happened after the shootout. And, I was, during this whole time, I was just vigorously taking notes as these historians discussed the various accounts and how reliable they are and what they independently claim, what contradictions exist in them. And then this same independent researcher, this reclusive guy, turned to all of us and asked if we wanted to see something special that he brought along for the tour. And of course we wanted to see this. We replied in chorus, of course, yeah, well, what do you have? And this historian reached into his pocket of his pantaloons and removed a small pepperbox pistol. He wasn't cosplaying, I just really like the word pantaloons. This pistol is a very small pistol. It's about the size of my hand from the bottom of the handle of it to the end of the barrels. It's very, very small, perfectly concealable in a pocket without, showing a bulge or anything. In the metal action in the trigger guard, they had some very small engravings that were nearly worn down. Nothing special, but just some swirls and some small flourishes, and it was actually kind of beautiful. The pistol didn't have a serial number, of course, just a couple of stamps with the patent date of 1837 and the Allen and Thurber company name. And the pistol, it was cold, and it was actually heavier than I expected for how much metal is actually contained in this little package. And this is actually a period gun. It wasn't a replica or something. It could be fired with a few caps, powder ball, and some wadding. And if memory serves right, it was a .32 caliber, which was the most common bore for all of these pepperbox pistols. So I took it and I held it and, I cycled the action a few times without letting the hammer hit the cap nipple. I didn't want to damage the gun, of course, but each turn of the barrels made a very satisfying little clink as the next barrel cycled to ready for the hammer. Just a light clink, clink, clink. And this may sound odd to hear, but feeling that pistol and holding it, it was an oddly peaceful experience. To be standing in the courtyard where Joseph Smith was assassinated, having heard the story from a missionary, and then, of course, further expounded by historians who knew more about the story than any missionary who ever staffs the Carthage Jail Tourist Center, and to be holding the same gun that Joe probably used in that very place. Just a deep sense of wonder and peace came over me. And I don't know what that was, but I couldn't help but get lost in thought at this time. Maybe it was just kind of pondering the fragility of life, or how such a monstrous tyrant bleeds just like you and me, how none of us are invincible and all of our time will be up one day. I can't tell you what that feeling was, but it was contemplative, and it was peaceful to be holding that gun in that place at that time, surrounded by those people who were so kind and generous to me as just the Mormon history apprentice of the group. So thank you, Joseph Johnston. So Joe and Hyrum were now both armed. If all went perfectly, Hyrum could get off one shot, and Joe 6 if the guns functioned perfectly. And maybe that would be enough to frighten off any attempt to, cause them harm or something, but why arm themselves? I doubt they considered that question in the abstract. If they were to attempt an escape, 7 balls couldn't do anything against companies of Carthage Greys. Maybe it was just a matter of having the pistols in their possession that provided a false sense of security, and that reason alone is enough. No matter what the situation, having the guns only made the situation worse for the prisoners, regardless of whether or not the guns were actually used. These were real human beings. These were not action movie heroes or video game characters. In no situation would these guns be helpful to them, but being armed while surrounded by hundreds of armed people who want you dead can provide that sense of security which was lacking for the men in the cell. Soon after Cyrus Wheelock armed Joseph with that pepperbox pistol, he left the jail cell with a message for Governor Ford, telling him not to hold any military parade in Nauvoo upon his arrival for fear that it was going to excite the citizens into violence. But before Wheelock left, Joe and Hyrum had some verbal messages for Cyrus to carry back to Nauvoo with him. Quote, Wheelock was entrusted with a verbal request to the commanders of the Legion to avoid all military display or any other movement calculated to produce excitement during the governor's visit. He was especially charged to use all the influence he possessed to have the brethren and friends of Joseph remain perfectly calm and quiet, inasmuch as they respected the feelings and well-being of their prophet and patriarch. Wheelock took a list of witnesses, names that were wanted for the expected trial on Saturday. When the list was read over, a number of names were stricken out, among whom were Alpheus Cutler and Reynolds Cahoon, it being deemed by Brother Hyrum unnecessary for them to attend. Brother Joseph asked the reason why they should not come. Hyrum answered, "They may be very good men, but they don't know enough to answer a question properly." Brother Joseph remarked, "That is sufficient." End quote. Like any good mafia, Hyrum knew who could keep a story straight, who was enough in the know to give the court the quote-unquote truthful account of what transpired. And Joe implicitly trusted his older brother. Quote, "The prisoners also sent many verbal messages to their families. They were so numerous that Dr. Richards proposed writing them all down, fearing Wheelock might forget. But Brother Hyrum fastened his eyes upon him and with a look of penetration said, 'Brother Wheelock will remember all that we tell him, and he will never forget the occurrences of this day.'" End quote. The man who armed the prophet with his famed pepperbox pistol departed Carthage for Nauvoo around 11 a.m., carrying a list of witnesses for Saturday's trial and a litany of verbal communications which were never recorded and will forever be lost to history. Around 11:30 in the morning, another messenger arrived carrying a curious letter. This messenger was Almond Babbitt, and the letter, which I teased back on episode 211, I said this, quote, "We must wait before we're able to discuss this message specifically." That's what I said back on episode 211, because this is a passage from Whiteout Willard Richards' journal of the day that I'm still trying to figure out. Here's the passage, quote, 11:30, Almond Babbitt arrived, read a letter from O. Cowdery, end quote. And that's it. Oliver Cowdery, cowdung all over, has been almost completely absent from our timeline since he was excommunicated in early 1838. This is back in episode 42, 43, with the Danites in the Missouri Mormon War, and here on the day of the prophet's death, Oliver Cowdery sent a letter to Joe and his friends. The last time that Ollie had shared correspondence with the Nauvoo leadership was actually back in December of 1843. Joe told Whiteout Willard Richards to, quote, "Write to Oliver Cowdery, ask him if he has eat husks long enough, if he is not most ready to return and be clothed in robes of righteousness and go up to Jerusalem. Orson Hyde need of him," end quote. Joe wanted Ollie back in the Mormon fold, and the way that he did it was degrading. "Hey, Ollie, are you sick of eating like a pig yet? You ready to come back where you belong?" But there could be more to it, as Joe had married Orson's wife, Marinda Nancy Johnson, while Orson was on a mission to Jerusalem. Maybe Ollie's wife, Elizabeth Ann Whitmer, sister of Peter, David, and John Whitmer, was Joe's next possible target. So the letter that Richards wrote with the help of Bloody Brigham is less condescending than Joe put it, but it's still quite fascinating. This is the letter that they wrote to Oliver Cowdery, quote, "We thought perhaps our old long-esteemed friend might by this time have felt his lonely, solitary situation, might feel that he was a stranger in a strange land and had wandered long enough from his father's house, and that he might have a disposition to return. If this is the case, all of you got to say is, your brethren are ready to receive you. We are not your enemies, but your brethren. Your dwelling place ought to be in Zion. Your labor might be needed in Jerusalem, and you ought to be a servant of the living God." End quote. That letter to Oliver Cowdery was written on April 19, 1843, but it wasn't sent until December 10th for unknown reasons. Well, here's Ollie's reply a few days after receiving the letter. Quote, "A friendly letter requires a like answer, and you are to understand in the outset that I entertain no unkindly feelings toward you or either of you. See that you have imagined with regard to my lonely, solitary situation, a stranger in a strange land, is true, strictly true. It has been a long time, nearly 6 years. The winds and waves, floods and storms have been arrayed to oppose me, and I need hardly say to you that the Lord alone has upheld me till I have fought up, labored up, and struggled up to a fair reputation and a fair business in my present profession." He was a lawyer at this time. "The circumstances under which I left Far West in June 1838 are familiarly known to you all. No doubt, those circumstances connected with myself and family are always painful to reflect on." Yeah, because he was excommunicated from the church. He was given 48 hours to leave the town. "But you will be reminded again that I do not charge or believe that either of you contributed anything to render my situation or circumstances then or afterwards in the least afflicting. And for this reason I speak more freely. I could not, nor will I concede that men who once took me by the hand under the sanction of the Holy Spirit when they received a high and holy calling would be induced under any consideration to even wish me harm. This is another reason why I read and look upon your epistle in the light that I do. This is one reason why I feel like answering it promptly and fairly. In fact, why I answer it at all. There is another circumstance to which I must now address, in which you, as members and principals in a great and increasing society, are interested, and in which also, whether in or out of that society, I feel and must continue to feel sensibly and keenly. It is a certain publication, appended to which are many names who are or were at the time members of the Church of Latter-day Saints, charging myself with being connected with outlaws. I cannot speak definitely of this instrument, as I know nothing of it except what has been related by those who say they have seen it. Now, what I have to say concerning... he's talking about the Danite Manifesto there. Now, what I have to say concerning all the difficulty between myself and your church, together with those charges last referred to, is simply this. I believed at the time, and still believe, that ambitious and wicked men, envying the harmony existing between myself and the first elders of the church, and hoping to get into some other men's birthright, by falsehood, the most foul and wicked, caused all this difficulty from beginning to end. They succeeded in getting myself out of the church, but since they themselves have gone to perdition, ought not old friends, long tried in the furnace of affliction, to be friends still, even laying out any view of any religious consideration? Accept assurance of my esteem, with all kindness, friendship, and fellowship, expressed in yours to me. Signed, Oliver Cowdery. P.S. This letter is designed as, and will be held by you, strictly private. Under no consideration is it to be exhibited to the public eye. End quote. Oliver Cowdery, from being Joe's scribe for the Book of Mormon to becoming the second elder of the church, to running the stake in Zion and then being chased out of Jackson County, Missouri by the mobs and settling in Far West with the first faction of the Saints to resettle there from independence, to attending the Kirtland Temple dedication ceremony, to charging the prophet with having a dirty, nasty, filthy affair with Fanny Alger, to being excommunicated from the church and targeted by Joe's shadow hit squad, the Danites, by name in the Danite Manifesto, which gave him 48 hours to leave Far West, or, quote, vengeance will overtake you at an hour when you do not expect, and at a day when you do not look for it, and for you there shall be no escape, for there is but one decree for you, which is, depart, or a more fatal calamity shall befall you, end quote. Ollie complied with the Danite Manifesto, and he remained in Missouri for a brief time, a stranger in a strange land, as he said, while the Mormons were forcibly removed from Missouri and they resettled in Illinois, eventually building Nauvoo, Joe's theocracy. During that interim period of 1839 to 1843, when this letter was sent and this little exchange happened in December of 1843, Cowdery actually moved back to Ohio, where he practiced law and politics. Now, in December 1843, his letter articulated his problems with the church, that the leaders were all good, but that there were some, quote, ambitious and wicked men hoping to get some other men's birthright, end quote, who caused all this difficulty from beginning to end. It was all those evil and designing men who, quote, succeeded in getting myself out of the church, end quote. Now, it's hard to know exactly who he's alluding to, possibly Dr. Sampson of Art or Thomas B. Marsh, the Danite Manifesto guys. Or maybe it was the Whitmer brothers, Peter, David, and John. Maybe it was Hinchpin, Sidney Rigdon. We don't know who he's talking about here, but because they themselves have gone to perdition, he believes that old friends to be friends still. He also concluded with the postscript that this letter should never be exhibited publicly, a burn notice basically, which I find quite remarkable. The great saga of Oliver Cowdery seems to conclude with him wanting to come back to the church in Nauvoo and set aside any and all religious consideration which may have caused the trouble with those in perdition who succeeded in removing him from the church. But, and this is important, Ollie didn't come back. He never made the trip back to Nauvoo to officially be refellowshipped into Joe's church. Now, on this day, June 27th, 1844, with Joe and Hyrum facing death before nightfall, Oliver Cowdery sent one final letter to the prophet, which was read to him just 6 hours before dying. This final letter between Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith said, quote, end quote, I don't know. I don't know what it said. The letter was never recorded anywhere. Nobody ever talked about the contents of it, and it's never been located. The final data point in the story of Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith is nothing more than a question mark. Was he trying to coordinate his return to Nauvoo? Was he castigating the leadership for all of their overtly treasonous activities? Was he asking for details about joining Orson Hyde on another journey to Jerusalem and asking about the safety of his wife Elizabeth should he choose to go? Was he relaying information about the church in Kirtland, which was just a few days' journey from where he lived in Tiffin, Illinois? Simply put, we'll probably never know, because that letter is lost to history. So disappointing. It's a cliff edge. I'm teetering on the cliff edge. I want to know what that letter said. But history doesn't care what we want. As the day wore on into afternoon, Governor Ford left Nauvoo after he disbanded the militias there and left a very small cohort of the Carthage Greys to guard the jail. The journey to Nauvoo was about 4 hours on horseback, and one of his advisors voiced what they were all thinking as they began this trip to Nauvoo. From Governor Ford, quote, "Having ordered the guard and left General Deming in command in Carthage, and discharged the residue of the militia, I immediately departed for Nauvoo, 18 miles distant, accompanied by Colonel Buckmaster, Quartermaster General, and Captain Dunn's company of dragoons." That's the McDonough boys. "After we had proceeded 4 miles, Colonel Buckmaster intimated to me a suspicion that an attack would be made upon the jail. He stated the matter as mere suspicion, arising from having seen 2 persons converse together at Carthage with some air of mystery." End quote. So Colonel Buckmaster, as a personal assistant to Governor Ford, this dude had his eyes peeled for any activity like this. Now, they'd obviously heard a lot of rumblings about, people taking vigilante justice on the prisoners, which is precisely why Governor Ford disbanded the militias to begin with. But this presented a dangerous situation because the foxes were now guarding the henhouse and Daddy was no longer in town to keep the situation under control. Ford, however, viewed the situation differently, but still took the advice of Colonel Buckmaster very seriously. He also had the voices of Stephen Markham, Dan Jones, Joel Miles, Cyrus Wheelock, and other men echoing through his mind that there was a conspiracy waiting for him to leave Carthage so that they could make the attack. Quote, I myself entertained no suspicion of such an attack, at any rate none before the next day in the afternoon, because it was notorious that we had departed from Carthage with the declared intention of being absent at least 2 days. I could not believe that any person would attack the jail whilst we were in Nauvoo, and thereby expose my life and the life of my companions to the sudden vengeance of the Mormons, upon hearing of the death of their leaders. Nevertheless, I sent back one company with a special order to Captain Smith to guard the jail strictly and at the peril of his life until my return. We proceeded on our journey 4 miles further, and by this time I had convinced myself that no attack would be made on the jail that day or night. I suppose that a regard for my safety and the safety of my companions would prevent an attack until those to be engaged in it could be assured of our departure from Nauvoo. I still think that this ought to have appeared to me to be a reasonable supposition." End quote. That may have appeared a reasonable supposition, but it's clear that Ford harbored some apprehensions about the safety of the prisoners. So he decided to make his visit to Nauvoo shorter than 2 days as originally planned, and determined to simply make a public speech to the Mormons about what was going on, and resolved to search for the counterfeit machine at a later time when tensions weren't so high. Quote, "I therefore determined at this point to omit making a search for counterfeit money at Nauvoo, and defer an examination of all the other abominations charged on that people, in order to return to Carthage that same night, that I might be on the ground in person in time to prevent an attack upon the jail, if any had been meditated. To this end, we called a halt. The baggage wagons were ordered to remain where they were until toward evening, and then return to Carthage." End quote. So Ford had ambitious plans upon his arrival to Nauvoo. Originally, he planned to find the counterfeit money machine, to investigate the charges of polygamy and sex trafficking, to interview folks about the night that the Expositor Press was destroyed, and to find out what actually happened and how big the riot was, to release any prisoners still in the city jail from that night or who had been committed to the jail since the city was put under martial law, and just to generally figure out the sentiment of the Mormons against their non-Mormon neighbors. These plans, however, had to be put on hold until a later time because Ford also kind of believed that an attack on the jail was going to be possible and that it was imminent. And maybe just his own presence in Nauvoo and the threat of immediate retaliation wasn't enough to keep his men from making that attack. So Ford needed to be in 2 places at once in order to keep the peace. Luckily for him, messengers had already arrived in Nauvoo to make sure that the Legion didn't muster or show any aggression whatsoever to Ford's posse on their arrival. Now, while this was transpiring, a militia force from Warsaw, the twin city to Carthage of the anti-Mormon political party, I almost said polygamous party, that's the Mormon party, so the anti-Mormon political party, it was marching toward Nauvoo to join Governor Ford's McDonough posse. Now, they'd yet to receive Governor Ford's orders to disband, and they were making their way to Nauvoo to join the forces in defense of Governor Ford and basically lay siege to the Mormon settlement in Nauvoo. The journey from Warsaw to Nauvoo is about 20 miles. It's slightly less than 1 day's journey on horseback. They had left Warsaw early that morning, and when they reached about the halfway point between Warsaw and Nauvoo, a messenger approached them, and this is at Golden Point, and conveyed Governor Ford's orders to disband. However, this messenger also told them that Governor Ford was not at Carthage, but in Nauvoo. This Warsaw contingent was led by a man named Colonel Levi Williams. Now, Colonel Williams has made a few appearances in our timeline, mostly connected with the horse thief Daniel Avery when that guy was arrested and taken across the Mississippi into Missouri to answer for old charges from the Missouri Mormon War. Now, Levi Williams is a prominent figure in the anti-Mormon movement. He was good friends with his neighbor, Thomas Sharp, whose paper, the Warsaw Signal, was the chief paper of anti-Mormonism. We've talked about Thomas Sharp and the Warsaw Signal a lot. Well, Levi Williams and Thomas Sharp were 2 founding members of the anti-Mormon political party. Levi Williams was a vocal critic who wanted to murder the prophet and any other Mormon who came across his path. But civil law and being a military officer kept him from being able to act out these violent fantasies. Well, Governor Ford even provides some insight into Colonel Levi Williams and his role on the day of June 27th. Quote, This was a circumstance well calculated to conceal from me the secret machinations on foot. I had constantly contended against violent measures, and so had the Brigadier General in command, Deming, and I am convinced that unusual pains were taken to conceal from both of us the secret measures resolved upon. It has been said, however, that some person named Levi Williams, in a public speech at Carthage, called for volunteers to murder the Smiths, and that I ought to have had him arrested. Whether such a speech was really made or not is yet unknown to me." End quote. Whether Levi Williams made such a speech asking for volunteers to storm the jail, that's still unknown, but he had enough people looking to him as their colonel, as their commander, to orchestrate the events of that evening. In a reminiscence from 1908, more than 70 years after the fact, a man named Matthew Caldwell spoke of Levi Williams' speech, and this is likely passed to him from oral tradition. Quote, "On the evening of June 26, 1844, the old mob leader, Colonel Levi Williams, with Tom Sharp, the editor of the Warsaw Sentinel," which was the Signal, not the Sentinel, "had a few new wagons rolled out from under a shed and placed a 2-inch plank on the box of one of the wagons. Colonel Williams then climbed on the box and gave orders for the captains of the militia to form their companies facing the wagon. As soon as the orders were obeyed, Colonel Levi Williams said, 'Boys, the governor's not going to do anything for us. All that is in favor of going to Carthage in the morning, step out 3 paces in front. Those contrary, stand fast.' At the word 'march,' all but 6 men stepped out." End quote. So Levi Williams and his band, they were actually headed to Nauvoo with the intent of basically sieging the city and eventually burning it to the ground and exterminating the citizens. However, because information traveled slowly, they didn't receive the orders to disband until they were already halfway through their journey to Nauvoo when they were at Golden Point. When this messenger told Colonel Levi Williams and his men that Ford had ordered the militias to disband but was on his way to Nauvoo, Colonel Levi Williams got an exciting idea. Most of his men turned around and went home. They went back home to Warsaw. Levi Williams, however, took a volunteer vigilante militia and they continued their journey to Carthage instead of Nauvoo for the remainder of the morning into the afternoon. A man named John Hay wrote about his eyewitness experience at this time while he was in Carthage in 1869, which I find more reliable than that previous quote of oral tradition that was recorded in 1908 by a Mormon who wasn't even alive when all these events actually transpired. From John Hay, 1869, quote, "Colonel Levi Williams read the governor's orders. Some of the anti-Mormon warriors, blessed with robust Western appetites, looked at the sun and concluded they could get home by dinner time, and under the influence of this aspiring idea, started off at a quick step. Captain Grover soon found himself without a company. Captain Aldrich essayed a speech calling for volunteers for Carthage. He did not make a fair start," says the Chronicle, "and Sharp came up and took it off his hands. Sharp," this is Thomas Sharp of the Warsaw Signal, "Sharp, being a spirited and impressive talker, soon had a respectable squad about him. Captain Davis, on the contrary, was sorely perplexed. It was heavy weather for him. He was a professional politician and clearly loved both Mormon and anti-Mormon votes. He was so backward in coming forward that his company left him in disgust and followed the fiery Grover, whose company had gone home for dinner. Davis still could not make up his mind to go home, but got into Calvin Cole's wagon and followed the boys at a distance, so that he had at last the luck to be in the closing scene and the honor to be indicted with the rest. The speeches of Grover and Thomas Sharp were rather vague. The purpose of murder does not seem to have been hinted. They protested against being made the tools and puppets of Tommy Ford. They were going to Carthage to see the boys and talk things over. Some of the cooler heads, such as Dr. Hay, surgeon of the regiment, denounced the proceeding and went at once back to Warsaw. So there's clearly a split in Levi Williams's boys here. Some want to go home. Some want to march on into Carthage. Some of them are disappointed that they're unable to make their march into Nauvoo and siege that city. Others are like, "Hey, what are you actually talking about, Thomas Sharp? Are we actually going to kill these guys? Like, I'm not too into this." There's clearly division, and the people who are making the speeches, Colonel Levi Williams, Grover, and Thomas Sharp here, they were concealing their true intent with what was the real plan here. So continuing on into this account. While they were waiting at the shanties, a courier came in from the Carthage Greys. It is impossible at this day to declare exactly the purport of his message. It is usually reported and believed that he brought an assurance from the officers of this company that they would be found on guard at the jail where the Smiths were confined, that they would make no real resistance, merely enough to save appearances. Now there's the foundation of the conspiracy. This message was not communicated to the men. They followed their leaders off on the road to Carthage with rather vague intentions. They were annoyed at the prospect of their picnic coming so readily to a close, at losing the fun of sacking Nauvoo, at having to go home without material for a single romance. Nearly 150 started with their captains, but they gradually dwindled in number to 75. These trudged along under the fierce summer sun of the prairies, towards the town where the cause of all the trouble and confusion of the last few years awaited them. They sang on the way a rude parody of a camp meeting hymn called in the West the Hebrew children. Where now is the prophet Joseph? Where now is the prophet Joseph? Where now is the prophet Joseph? Safe in Carthage jail. That's really in here in this account. The farther they walked, the more the idea impressed itself upon them that now was the time to finish the matter totally. The unavowed design of the leaders communicated itself magnetically to the men until the entire company became fused into one mass of bloodthirsty energy by an excess of precaution. They did not go directly into the town, but made a long detour so as to come in by the road leading from Nauvoo. Now, this St. John Hay offers some really interesting insights into the mind of the conspirators at this point. He says specifically that they became fused into one mass of bloodthirsty energy. Then he goes on to say, it would be difficult to imagine anything cooler than this quiet perjury to screen a murder. Yet the cool-blooded murder, cold-blooded, that's what he's saying. Yet the strangest part of this strange story is that Frank Worrell was a generous young fellow, and the men with whom he carried out the ghastly comedy of attack and resistance at the door of the prison, Sharp and Grover, were good citizens, educated and irreproachable, who still live to enjoy the respect and esteem of all who know them. There is but one force mighty enough in the world to twist such minds and consciences to so fearfully awry, and that is the wild supposition bred of civil strife. A few months of this miniature war in Hancock County had sufficed to possess many of the prominent actors with the spirit of demons, and in the mind of any anti-Mormon there was nothing more criminal in the shooting of Smith than in the slaying of a wolf or panther." End quote. With this dehumanization total and complete, assassinating the Smiths that day was merely pest removal, the way that we would exterminate a rat infestation. People who were otherwise good and honest and respectable, irreproachable characters, good people, completely succumbed to base instincts and tribalism. Levi Williams made the decision to take his small group of men into Carthage via a circuitous route to appear to be coming from Nauvoo, and then the plans were formed and put into play with the help of a guy named Frank Worrell, who was stationed in Carthage. This is from Governor Ford's account. Quote, "A communication was soon established between the conspirators and Levi Williams's company, and it was arranged that the guard should have their guns discharged with blank charges and fire at the assailants when they attempted to enter the jail." End quote. So, according to the plan, when the time was right, Levi Williams's men would be attacking the militia in a conspiracy with the company of the Carthage Greys that were stationed to guard the jail under the command of Frank Worrell. So when the men from Williams's mob attacked, Frank Worrell and his small platoon of Carthage Greys would fire blank rounds at them as if they were attempting to defend the prisoners, thus providing a shield of plausible deniability. So this plan was put into place as Governor Ford said it, a communication was soon established between the conspirators and Colonel Levi Williams's company. And that's all we needed. The whole thing was in place. This was everything that was needed in order, all that was needed after this was a change in the guard that evening in order to get Frank Worrell, the conspirators, to be the actual jail guards. once Colonel Deming, who Ford put in place. And Colonel Deming was the guy who the anti-Mormons said that he was a Mormon sympathizer. Once Colonel Deming, that Ford put in place to oversee all of the prison watch duties, realized that a mutiny was afoot by Frank Worrell and Colonel Levi Williams, he was going to flee town because his men were no longer loyal to Governor Ford and himself. The conspirator that was guarding this jail, once the guard changed, this is Frank Worrell, and this is a guy's name that we need to keep in mind. He would aid the mob in getting into the jail after their feigned attack on him and his men. And this plan was put into motion. The wheels of vigilante justice were already rolling and gaining speed. And Colonel Levi Williams would arrive in Carthage with his mutinous gang close to 5 that evening. Now, another point that I want to discuss here emerges from those previous accounts, and that's Tom Ass Sharp, the editor of the Warsaw Signal. And Thomas Sharp has centered in our Nauvoo timeline as the most prominent vocal critic of the Mormon Empire and the prophet himself. And I've looked for a long time to determine whether or not Thomas Sharp was actually part of Levi Williams's mob that assaulted the jail. Unfortunately, there isn't a solid answer here. Thomas Sharp was obviously guilty of stoking the flames that led to the assassination in Carthage jail and calling for the extermination of the Mormons following the destruction of the Expositor Press. Hyrum Smith even threatened to burn down the Warsaw Signal, Sharp's paper, for what Sharp was printing in the furor burning through the area. Levi Williams and Thomas Sharp, they were friends and they were neighbors in Warsaw, but Sharp wasn't an officer in the Warsaw militia. So Thomas Sharp had no reason to be marching with Levi Williams's boys to begin with, unless storming the jail was premeditated the previous evening, as that 1908 Mormon account claimed. And a few later accounts place Thomas Sharp in Carthage that night on June 27th, and he eventually stood trial for the murders. But another account that's earlier than the accounts which put him there states explicitly, quote, "I was pushed and shoved some 50 feet, did not see Sharp, Grover, or Davis," end quote. However, just because that person didn't see Thomas Sharp in the crowd doesn't mean that Thomas Sharp wasn't there. It's one of those data points that remains a bit of a mystery, and the data point is actually pretty consequential. Sharp's account of the jail storm is oddly accurate as a report of the events, and it was published immediately after their deaths, as in just a few hours after the assault occurred, which means that he himself participated and immediately fled the 18 miles from Carthage back to Warsaw, and then began immediately writing and immediately printing the paper that was published that night, which would be quite a feat with the very slim margins of time. Or that Sharp remained in Warsaw, and as soon as the first participants of the mob arrived back in Warsaw and conveyed the account to Sharp, that's when he started printing the extra. Now, I will point out, in his account, Thomas Sharp claims a Mormon attempted to rush the jail and break out the prisoners as like the catalyst, as the inciting incident, but there is no evidence for this, and all of the evidence indicates the contrary. It was characteristic, however, of Thomas Sharp to accuse the Mormons as the aggressors in any conflict that he reported in his Warsaw Signal. Sharp's article, however, prints information that was unknown to any Carthaginians that he must have received by express messenger reporting the movement of Governor Ford in Nauvoo, who immediately was exchanging information between Nauvoo and Warsaw. Now, these cities form a triangle, with Nauvoo as the northernmost tip of that triangle, Carthage down and to the right, and Warsaw down and to the left. And it's nearly equidistant between all three of these cities. So, Governor Ford was in Nauvoo. Thomas Sharp had information on Governor Ford's whereabouts on the night that the assassination happened, which means that he was acquiring information from messengers who were funneling information back and forth from Nauvoo to Warsaw, which would be really hard to do if the dude was in Carthage at the time. And Sharp also messes up the sequence of events by a few hours here and there, which leads me to believe that he wasn't in Carthage, but he was just reporting on intel the messengers and reporters were bringing to him in Warsaw while he was preparing his extra for that evening. He also falsely says that Willard Richards almost died from it when it was actually John Taylor who nearly died in the assassination attempt. Richards got a scratch on the ear. John Taylor was turned into Swiss cheese. Now, Sharp's article also reads to me like he was reporting events from what people told him, not from his first-person witness account. So simply put, Tom Ass Sharp, I say Tom Ass because in Joe's younger brother's paper, The Wasp, he would always refer to Thomas Sharp as Tom Ass Sharp because Mormons are so good with their nicknames, right? Basically, Thomas Sharp's account reads secondhand, and it contains numerous inaccuracies, and the accounts which place him there are almost all late accounts, and they're all second or third hand accounts, and they're all almost exclusively provided by Mormons who viewed Thomas Sharp as their public enemy number one, if Levi Williams wasn't their public enemy number one. History often leaves us with ambiguities like this. So whenever I'm talking about Levi Williams and his boys storming Carthage jail, just know that Tom Ass Sharp may have been part of the crowd, but he also may not have been part of the crowd. It's just really hard to know. As Levi Williams's troops shifted their destination from Nauvoo to Carthage, the prisoners took lunch at 1:15. Now, Joe, Hyrum, and Whiteout Willard ate lunch in the uppermost apartment, while Stephen Markham and John Taylor ate their lunch in the lower apartment that was adjacent to the kitchen. Now, it was generally agreed that the second story was safer than the ground floor of the jail because assailants would have a much harder time firing into a window of the second story as opposed to just firing straight into a window on the ground level like Pistolback and Porter did to Governor Wilbur Boggs. So after dinner, Stephen Markham left the jail to acquire a pipe and some smoking tobacco and bring it back to the prisoners to enjoy after their meal. Now, at this time, Dan Jones was about to depart Carthage to carry a letter to Orville Browning in Quincy. Now, Orville Browning had served as Joe's legal counsel back in 1841 when he was arrested by constables on order from Missouri. So Joe wanted to retain Orville Browning in addition to Hugh Reed and James Woods to help him in the coming trial on June 29th. So Dan Jones, the Varus of Nauvoo, Captain Dan Jones of the Ferry of the Nauvoo, this Danite Jones, he tells of his experience in Carthage acting as a courier in a really hostile environment. Quote, "Even though the guards did not allow me to go into the jail, nor for Joseph Smith to come out, yet they permitted Willard Richards to come, to whom I informed everything which I understood of the designs of the mobs to kill them before nightfall. He told me that I was in more danger outside, and he placed a letter in my hand with the request of Joseph Smith that I take it to Quincy, about 60 miles away, and return as soon as I could. News of the letter went throughout the mob like the wings of the breeze, and some claimed that it was orders for the Nauvoo Legion to come there to save the prisoners, and others claimed some other things. When I was requesting my horse to be readied, some swore that I would not go from there alive if I did not give the letter to them." So, to summarize that point, Dan Jones is headed out with a letter to Orville Browning to ask him to represent Joe on the upcoming trial that Saturday. Dan Jones has this letter in his pocket, and he's about to leave Carthage, but everybody in Carthage, all of the anti-Mormons there that are guarding the jail, and all the Carthage Greys are like, "Hey, what are you doing? What's in that letter?" They thought that the letter was actually an order to the Nauvoo Legion to come into Carthage to storm the city, to storm the jail, and to break the prisoners out. So they said, "You're not leaving. You're not leaving with this." He goes on to say, "But they could not agree about this, which was just as well for me, for I was determined to die rather than release the letter from my hand. Then they divided into 2 or 3 groups. One group wanted to chase me from there immediately, letter and all. Another group threatened that I would not reach Nauvoo alive, and at that I saw several of them with rifles in their hands run across the fields to the nearby woods through which the road to Nauvoo passed. Although I understood their purpose, yet I did not see how I could be delivered, but some way would come, I doubted not a bit. While they were quarreling amongst themselves," this is straight out of a terrible sitcom. "While they were quarreling amongst themselves, my horse was readied nearby, and I saw my chance. And it was no time after I reached the saddle before the horse and I were out of their sight in the midst of a cloud of dust and bullets whistling through the air everywhere except they were aiming." Okay. They were all bickering about the contents of this letter too much that they didn't notice him run and go hop on his horse. And then as he's riding away, they're like, oh, where did he go? And then they try and shoot him, and then none of them can hit him. It beggars belief. Okay, it's like it's out of an action flick. It's out of some terrible sitcom. It's just kind of hilarious. Then he goes on to say, though, I understood my mistake after having a look at the countryside around me, and I crossed the prairies to the right road. After that, I understood that by my horse's mistake, my life had been saved from those who were watching for me in the woods, right? Because there were guys who headed off into the woods on the road to Nauvoo who were going to shoot at him as soon as he crossed their path, right? For I had gone a mile further without turning from the Warsaw road, I would have no doubt been killed by about 300 of the most cruel of all the mobocrats who were coming along the road to Carthage and who killed the prisoners no more than 2 hours after that. End quote. So, in all of that, Dan Jones hops on his horse and he flees out of town as these guys are apparently shooting at him, and there's dust cloud and they're arguing and bickering, and they don't notice that he hops on his horse, and then they see that he gets out there and they shoot at him, but they can't. None of them can hit him like he's Samuel on the wall, Samuel the Lamanite. He realized that the direction that he rode out of town was actually west towards Colonel Levi Williams' troops. And he realized if his horse didn't turn the other direction, it would have taken him up the road towards Nauvoo. The snipers would have got him in the tree line. But if he wouldn't have realized the mistake of his direction, he would have marched right into Levi Williams' boys, who are on their way from Warsaw, having, changed their course from Nauvoo to Carthage so that they could assault the jail. If he had continued down that road, he probably would have died because he was facing a rogue militia that was about to kill the prophet. Why not kill a courier of the prophet? Luckily, he recognized all the error of his ways, and he diverted his path basically through the woods toward the north, toward Nauvoo, and passing where those guys were, camped out in the woods trying to snipe at him. He completely routed around the side of them and then headed on his path towards Nauvoo, north. And he actually passed Governor Ford on his way there. Now, Dan Jones and Governor Ford, they continued kind of their respective journeys towards Nauvoo, though with vastly different missions, right? And notably as well, the gunshots that Dan Jones said that they were shooting at him, bullets were whistling by his head. None of those gunshots were reported by Willard Richards or anybody else as Dan Jones was leaving town. That means that they probably didn't shoot at him while he was riding out of town. Those are just fun details that he added to make himself sound like more of a hero in the midst of a circumstance where there were no heroes. But events in Carthage began to signal that all was not well, and the warnings that Dan Jones gave to Whiteout Willard Richards were justified. There were the 8 men guarding the jail specifically, and about 60 Carthage Greys were stationed as guards throughout the town, and they were cycling through who was on active duty at the jail itself. Frank Worrell was about to be one of the newly rotated in immediate guards of the jail. Whiteout Willard Richards recorded in his journal that tensions were really beginning to excite. Quote, 3:15 p.m. The guard have been more severe in their operations, threatening among themselves or telling what they would do when the war was over. One would sell his farm and move out of the state if Smith stayed. End quote. And as the militia became more excited and combative in Carthage, Governor Ford arrived in Nauvoo. His arrival was, luckily, preceded by the letter from Joe to Emma and a whole bunch of other communications to the church and city leaders just to stay home, to not make any show of force or to make any demonstration. Don't arm yourself. Don't do anything that would seem threatening to the governor, because Joe trusted Governor Ford, simply put. And everybody recognized this as their opportunity to gain Ford's favor in this conflict that the Mormons were going to be on their best behavior while he was in town. So Governor Ford first went to the Nauvoo mansion, and he held a meeting with his advisors and some men of the Nauvoo government. An occurrence happened here before Ford gave his speech in the town square in Nauvoo, and the details of this are kind of tough to deal with. Pistol, Packin, Porter, Rockwell gave an affidavit in April 1856. 1856 is 12 years after this happened. 1856, Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell gave this affidavit in Utah that paints a disturbing and ominous picture of the situation, and I need to give voice to this perspective through Pistol Pack and Porter. Porter had attended a meeting earlier in the day in the same room that Governor Ford held his meeting as soon as he arrived in Nauvoo. But Porter Rockwell forgot his hat, so he returned to that room in order to retrieve his hat. And here's what he reports happened, once again, 12 years after the fact, when Governor Ford was seen as one of the people that was responsible for the deaths that happened that evening. Quote, "The said Rockwell had of necessity to enter said upper room for his hat, and as he entered the door, all were sitting silent except one man," that's Governor Ford, "who was standing behind a chair making a speech, and while in the act of dropping his right hand from an uplifted position said, 'The deed is done before this time,' which were the only words I heard while in the room, for on seeing me they all hushed in silence. At the time I could not comprehend the meaning of the words, but in a few hours after I understood them, referring to the murder of Joseph and Hyrum Smith in Carthage jail. Signed, Orrin P. Rockwell." End quote. Like I said earlier, this affidavit was given 12 years after the incident during the early Mormon Reformation era, which was marked by militant anti-government culture by the Utah Church. Almost immediately after the events of Carthage, Governor Ford was blamed by the Mormons for the assassinations, and that rhetoric continued for over a decade, and Porter Rockwell, a murderer at heart and Joe's personal destroying angel and friend from childhood, man of God, son of thunder, who cut not your hair, nor in a no pistol or blade will harm thee, or no whatever he said, whatever that revelation is. It's on the back of one of my whiskey bottles. This man of God, son of thunder, Porter Rockwell, Pistol Pack and Porter, put on record that he witnessed this conversation happen, that Governor Ford said, "The deed is done before this time." This is tough to deal with. His affidavit and dozens of speeches given by church leaders in Utah have played into the narrative that Governor Ford orchestrated the assassinations and left Carthage for Nauvoo that morning for that very purpose. According to this narrative, Governor Ford had a secret alliance with Colonel Levi Williams and Thomas Sharp and the Carthage Greys to attack the Carthage jail while Governor Ford was in Nauvoo. Then he would leave Nauvoo before a messenger could arrive to town to tell the Mormons what had happened, thus nullifying the Mormons' ability to retaliate against Ford while he was there. And my response to that argument and to that line of rhetoric and to the way that the stories have been told since the events of June 27th, 1844 transpired, my response to that argument is it's plausible. It is plausible, but there's no contemporary evidence to prove it. What evidence do we have to contradict this conspiracy narrative? Ford's own words and actions. But to the person who's making this argument, they aren't inclined to believe Governor Ford to begin with, so why does that matter? And we can look at this conspiracy narrative in a few ways. Ford was absolutely fed up with the Mormons and just the general lawlessness of the Mormon leadership. And it may be the case that the only way that he sought to keep from this state devolving into civil war was for the chief aggressor to simply not exist anymore. Joseph Smith was responsible for what was going on, for the state of Illinois being on the precipice of civil war. If Joe was gone, then problems are solved, right? But to counter that idea, though, with how high the tensions were between the Mormons in Nauvoo and the anti-Mormons in Carthage and Warsaw, the death of Joseph Smith almost ensured that civil war would break out, with retribution for killing their supreme leader being that final catalyst. That would be the spark that ignited the powder barrels that the entire state was sitting on. Joseph Smith being assassinated wouldn't calm tensions, it would escalate tensions. So if Ford had orchestrated the death of Joe during his absence, the last place that he would want to be was in Nauvoo. He stated for himself that he thought the vigilantes wouldn't attack while he was in Nauvoo, as it would surely result in the Mormons killing him immediately, which he thought that was enough insurance to make the trip to begin with. However, we can also conclude that he disbanded the various militias to make the vigilante attack safer for the vigilantes. He would want the militias to be disbanded, as it would be less likely that the remaining people in town would uphold the law over upholding the designs of the vigilantes. That argument can also be flipped on its head. If Ford believed that an assassination was more likely with more men in Carthage, then disbanding the militias was the smartest thing that he could have done, so that there were less men in Carthage who actually wanted to kill the prophet. The way I see it, there is no bedrock on whether or not Ford conspired to have Joe assassinated, and reasonable people can disagree about to what extent Ford bears the blame for their deaths. What can't be disputed, however, is that Joseph Smith himself was responsible for his own death. Sure, he didn't call together the militia and tell them to assassinate him, but he inflamed the non-Mormons around Nauvoo for over half a decade and brought an entire state to the precipice of civil war. If not in Carthage, Joe would have been assassinated at some point in his life, because he'd so thoroughly demonstrated his ability to flaunt the law to the point that only vigilante law could hold him accountable. It's not an endorsement of vigilante law. It's just the reality of the situation. So many times in his life, he escaped death by the edge of unlikely circumstances and, of course, high-profile lawyers helping him to evade the law. His luck would run out eventually, if not in Carthage, then somewhere else down the line. Regardless of responsibility, when Governor Ford made his way into Nauvoo and held his little meeting that Porter apparently barged in on to grab his hat and said the deed is done, thousands of Mormons came out to attend his public speech, and he mustered the disbanded Nauvoo Legion. Now, he remembers a few details of his speech in his own History of Illinois, and it's also reported in the History of the Church in much briefer form. So let's start with the History of Church and then see what Governor Ford himself remembered of his own speech. From the History of the Church, quote, "The governor was making to the saints in Nauvoo one of the most infamous and insulting speeches that ever fell from the lips of an executive. Well, kind of poisoning the well, but let's see what he says. Among other things, he said, 'A great crime has been done by destroying the expositor press and placing the city under martial law, and a severe atonement must be made. So prepare your minds for the emergency. Another cause of excitement is the fact of your having so many firearms. The public are afraid that you are going to use them against government. I know there is a great prejudice against you on account of your peculiar religion, but you ought to be praying saints, not military saints. Depend upon it. A little more misbehavior from the citizens, and the torch, which is now already lighted, will be applied. The city may be reduced to ashes, and extermination would inevitably follow. And it gave me great pain to think that there was danger of so many innocent women and children being exterminated. If anything of a serious character should befall the lives or property of the persons who are prosecuting your leaders, you will be held responsible." End quote. Now, this is viewed in the history of the church as absolutely unfair treatment, persecution, and just downright prejudice by the governor. And of course, it's all religious prejudice, right? But I fail to see any point in that statement that the history of the church records where he's actually wrong. Yes, a great crime was committed by destroying the Nauvoo expositor. Yes, somebody had to pay the legal price for it. Yes, the non-Mormon neighbors of the Mormons were incredibly intimidated by the Mormons having so many damn guns and the militia larger than any other state in the country. Yes, the Mormons had used their guns and militia against the government before, so the people nearby were afraid that happened in Missouri. What was going to happen in Illinois as well? Yes, they ought to be praying saints instead of military saints. If only more Christians could follow that today, because that would be much less intimidating and would probably cause the non-Mormon neighbors to be much more friendly. Yes, a little more misbehavior from the Mormons would absolutely result in civil war, and the government and vigilante militias would eventually overwhelm the Mormon forces and burn Nauvoo to ashes, and another extermination order would quickly follow. Yes, if anything bad happened to anybody who was trying to hold the leadership legally accountable, then the Mormons would be blamed. Taken in the context of everything which transpired, this account of Ford's speech in the history of the church doesn't reveal to me anything where he was mistaken. The dude knew the situation, and he knew who the aggressors were in the situation. He knew who bore the blame. He knew about all of the prejudice in the neighboring cities and also understood from where that prejudice sprang. Believe it or not, the people of the day didn't hate the Mormons because they worshipped a false god. It's because they were a criminal empire with a supreme leader who viewed himself as above the laws by which everyone else abided. Ford's speech is reported in such a way as to prejudice the reader against any government official, which is far more troubling to me than anything Ford actually said. So let's read what Ford remembered of his speech in his History of Illinois. Quote, "Having made these arrangements, we proceeded on our march and arrived at Nauvoo about 4 o'clock of the afternoon of the 27th day of June. As soon as notice could be given, a crowd of citizens assembled to hear an address, which I proposed to deliver to them. The number present has been variously estimated from 1 to 5,000. In this address, I stated to them how and in what their functionaries had violated the laws. Also, the many scandalous reports in circulation against them, and that these reports, whether true or false, were generally believed by the people. I distinctly stated," and that's a point that we made on this show a couple of times. It didn't matter whether or not the charges were true. What really mattered was the people believed that the charges were true. Many of them really were, but that's beside the point. The people believing that the charges are true is what leads to action. And that's really the point that Governor Ford is driving here. I distinctly stated to them the amount of hatred and prejudice which prevailed everywhere against them, and the causes of it at length. I also told them plainly and emphatically that if any vengeance should be attempted openly or secretly against the persons or property of the citizens who had taken part against their leaders, that the public hatred and excitement was such that thousands would assemble for the total destruction of their city and the extermination of their people, and that no power in the state would be able to prevent it." End quote. You see, many of his statements that are reported in the history of the church are corroborated by himself in a way that he basically summarized them, because they're true. Those statements that he made to the Mormons in this speech that he probably spoke for an hour or two were true. And, of course, thanks to the preaching of Joe and other church leaders, the Mormons viewed themselves as persecuted and unfairly treated by the system of law. Joe had so successfully poisoned the well that even the governor of Illinois, paying the Mormons a personal visit to tell them what's going on, was treated with hostility and viewed as further evidence of the persecution complex. He continues, quote, "During this address, some impatience and resentment were manifested by the Mormons at the recital of the various reports enumerated concerning them, which they strenuously and indignantly denied to be true. They claimed to be a law-abiding people and insisted that as they looked to the law alone for their protection, so were they careful themselves to observe its provisions. Upon the conclusion of this address, I proposed to take a vote on the question whether they would strictly observe the laws, even in opposition to their prophet and leaders. The vote was unanimous in favor of this proposition." End quote. Ford was able to calm the tensions and to get the people to vote to just uphold the law unanimously, even if the verdict reached was against their supreme leader. However, Ford also offers some other insights about the visit. Quote, "The anti-Mormons contended that such a vote from the Mormons signified nothing, and truly the subsequent history of that people showed clearly that they were the loudest in their professions of attachment to the law whenever they were guilty of the greatest extravagances, and in fact that they were so ignorant and stupid about matters of law that they had no means of judging the legality of their own conduct, only as they were instructed by their spiritual leaders." End quote. Joe was a criminal kingpin, and he had so deeply and thoroughly controlled the Mormons' view of reality that they trusted him to a fault, to their own destruction. They trusted him to the point that committing treason against the nation was viewed by them as discrimination against their religion. Anybody with as much power as Joseph Smith inevitably creates situations like this where laws are seen as the infractions against liberty, religious liberty. Media is the enemy of the people, which is, it's something that Joe preached against in May of 1844 that we read on the last episode. The media is the enemy of the people, and that any investigation into the conduct of a demagogue like Joe is just a witch hunt that's conducted by unprincipled people with an agenda. It's like, if you didn't break laws, then there wouldn't be any investigations, Joe. If you didn't break the laws, you wouldn't be in Carthage jail. So Ford gave this speech, and then he took supper at the Nauvoo mansion, where Emma, was preparing a meal for the men and for the other patrons who were staying at the Nauvoo mansion that night. And as they were taking supper in Nauvoo, they likely chatted with Emma for some time. No record of any conversation they may have shared survives to this day, but I find it likely that Emma and Governor Ford were actually on first-name basis, and that Emma, she was on a first-name basis with the previous governor, Governor Carlin, but the extent of Ford's and Emma's acquaintanceship is, prior to this meal is pretty unknown. But Ford remained in Nauvoo for the space of about 3 hours, having arrived between 3 and 4 p.m. and departing around 6 or 7 that evening as the sun sank lower into the hot, muggy June Mississippi night. Meanwhile, Colonel Levi Williams's men were approaching ever nearer to Carthage, having made an alliance with Frank Worrell and the small contingent of the Carthage Greys who remained on guard. Brigadier General Deming was stationed in or near the Carthage jail in order to oversee the guards and to supervise the change of guards cycling out every 4 to 6 hours throughout the day. Franklin Worrell was the primary guard on duty for the last cycle of that day. George Stegall, the jailer of Carthage, was engaging in conversation with the prisoners throughout the day, and George Stegall didn't seem to hold much animus against the prisoners, in spite of being a Carthage resident. Joe and George Stegall chatted about the dissenters who printed the Expositor, William and Wilson Law, as well as Joseph H. Jackson, who Joe thought was responsible for so many of his problems. But the men thought that it was kind of weird, because Stephen Markham had left the jail over an hour ago after lunch to fetch a pipe and smoking tobacco, but he had yet to return. Well, George Stegall told Joe what happened. Markham had apparently acquired the pipe and tobacco, but as he was returning to the jail, he was surrounded by a small group of Carthage Greys, and he was chased out of town. By this point in the afternoon, after Stephen Markham was chased out, the number of Joe loyalists in town was dwindling. Cyrus Wheelock, who gave Joe the pepperbox pistol, was out of town. Dan Jones, he'd been chased out and apparently shot at, and he was headed to Nauvoo after refusing to give up the letter that he was trying to take to Over Browning in Quincy. John S. Fulmer, who gave Joe the single-shot pistol, left for Nauvoo that morning carrying verbal messages to the leadership prior to Governor Ford's arrival. Joel S. Miles also left that morning with a letter to Emma. Stephen Markham was the last loyalist in Carthage, and the Greys wanted to rectify that problem. According to Stephen Markham, quote, a man by the name of Stewart, end quote, approached him and told him to leave town, stating that he had 5 minutes to comply with the order. Stephen Markham refused to comply with that order, and he attempted to make his way toward the jail, because that's where his friends were. It's the only place that he viewed as safe in the city of Carthage. At which point, this Stewart guy charged Markham with his bayonet. And then one of them knocked the other down, a huge scuffle ensued, and then a group of Carthage Greys rallied behind their friend and surrounded Stephen Markham, Piggy Bank Steve, as we called him many, many moons ago, when they were beginning to settle Commerce, Illinois, that became Nauvoo. And these men surrounded him and pointed their bayonet-equipped rifles at Markham. They told Markham that if he didn't leave town, they'd kill him on the spot. So they went and got Markham's horse while holding him at bayonet and gunpoint, and they got his horse and said, you're leaving town right now. And they forced him out. So the jailer, George Stegall, conveyed this information to Joseph Smith. So now the only Joe loyalists in Carthage were Hyrum, sidekick of Smith, Joe's older brother, Whiteout Willard Richards, John Taylor, and Joe himself. All these men were in Carthage jail itself, and only Whiteout Willard Richards had a pass to come and go as he pleased. The walls of the jail were already suffocating, but the walls of the village of Carthage were closing in on the prophets. They could all sense that the situation wasn't right. Something was really, really off about the town, and it was getting a bit more tense in the city. The guards who changed over at 4 were more confrontational, and they seemed more hostile. Governor Ford wasn't expected to return until the next day, and they knew that if Ford was in town, they were safe. But right now, Governor Ford was 18 miles away. His promises of safety were now just hollow words. The men attempted to pass the time and comfort each other. The jailer, George Stegall, could sense that something was wrong as well. He suggested that they stay the night in the jail of the upper floor, which actually had a locking gate on the door, and it had, thicker walls. Quote, suggested that they would be safer in the jail, end quote. Joe didn't like jail cells, and he'd been in jail cells on previous occasions, but he agreed with Stegall. Quote, Joseph said, after supper, we will go in, end quote. So the door to the jail cells on the second floor actually had a functioning latch. The upper story apartment, the door was broken, and Fulmer and Markham had fiddled with the latch with their penknife in order to try and sort of make it work, but they weren't very successful. The latch on the door to the debtor's prison on the second floor, it didn't work very well. And as the reality of the situation set in, Joe turned to Whiteout Willard Richards and asked him a hard question. Quote, if we go in the jail, will you go in with us? Doctor answered, Brother Joseph, you did not ask me to cross the river with you. You did not ask me to come to Carthage. You did not ask me to come to jail with you. And do you think that I would forsake you now? But I will tell you what I will do. If you are condemned to be hung for treason, I will be hung in your stead, and you shall go free. Joseph responded, you cannot. Doctor said, I will. End quote. Remember, throughout all of this, Whiteout Willard Richards wasn't charged with any crimes, and he had a pass to leave the jail at any time, which would render him the same treatment as Stephen Markham and Dan Jones and Joel S. Miles of being chased out of town at gunpoint. But at least he'd be able to make it back to Nauvoo alive. It was his decision to be in the jail that evening as the situation became more intense all around the prisoners. Whiteout Willard was nothing if not loyal to his superiors, whether that be Joe or his cousin, Bloody Brigham Young, as his counselor in the nation of Deseret. The 4 men were powerless to change their circumstances. All they could do was pass the time and just kind of hope that they'd be safe. After supper, instead of going into the jail, they remained in the upper apartment of the jail, protected only by a thin wooden door with a broken latch. Hyrum picked up his 1830 copy of the works of Flavius Josephus and read from it for a while. And some have claimed that Hyrum also thumbed through a Book of Mormon at this time, right, prior to the assassination, and read some passages and possibly even dog-eared one page. That's not true. There's no contemporary record of him reading anything this day other than the writings of Flavius Josephus. So to help pass the time and to also comfort the men's nerves, John Taylor sang a hymn derived from an 1826 poem titled The Stranger and His Friend. John Taylor had learned this poem while he was on his mission in England back in 1841, and it has since been adapted by Protestant churches as a hymn titled A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief. After John Taylor finished singing the poem, it left the men contemplative and a bit at peace, and Hyrum requested that he sing it again, and Taylor complied. The jailer's son brought some water to the men, and they requested to see the jailer himself, George Stegall. As Stephen Markham had been chased out of Carthage before he could deliver the pipe and the smoking tobacco, the men were still wanting to satisfy their palates or their lungs. Joe asked George Stegall, the jailer, if he could bring them, quote, a bottle of wine, pipe, and 2 small papers of tobacco, end quote. Joe gave Stegall $2.50, but George Stegall, he was a good guy. He refused and said $1 was enough. He returned in just a few moments with all of the materials, the pipe and 2 small papers of tobacco, as well as a bottle of wine. And that would get all 4 men excommunicated from the church today, and then they partook to help calm their nerves. Then the guard changed over. Franklin Worrell was the guard on duty with the devious plan conceived of by him and Colonel Levi Williams. Whiteout Willard Richards scratched his final entry in his journal for that day. Quote, 4 o'clock, changed guard. 415 end quote. Governor Ford was having a friendly little chat with Emma as she was feeding him and his men supper while she was 4 months pregnant with little David Hyrum Smith. The rest of the Smith children, Julia, Joseph III, Frederick, and Alexander, they scampered about the house, not knowing why everybody was so anxious, and there was an odd feeling that kind of pervaded the Mormon community. They only knew that Daddy and Uncle Hyrum were gone, and that Mom and Aunt Mary were more stressed than usual with all of these strange men visiting the house. Eliza Snow sat anxiously in the Stephen Markham home as Stephen Markham returned home, having left his walking cane behind in his haste to flee Carthage at gunpoint. Piggybank Steve undoubtedly regaled Eliza and his wife with what happened in Carthage that morning. Lenora Snow took supper with her husband Isaac Morley and her sister wife Lucy in the little Mormon settlement of Yelrum, south of Carthage. They hadn't received word for quite some time about what was going on in Nauvoo or in nearby Carthage, and they couldn't rely on any information that they got from Nauvoo because that information had to pass through Carthage before reaching Yelrum, because Carthage intersected the two Mormon cities. Maybe the Yelrum Mormons, like Lenora Snow, would be forced to give up their guns and to flee to the motherland of Nauvoo before all of this was over. Maybe they'd be allowed to just exist happily in their little communistic village. Brigadier General Deming, who was loyal to Governor Ford and was tasked with overseeing the guard duties of the jail, he could sense that a mutiny was afoot, as the newest guards under Frank Worrell were confrontational, and they were much more abusive to the prisoners than the previous guard duty. So Brigadier General Deming was on high alert. As these people took their supper, Colonel Levi Williams, and maybe with his best friend Tom Ass Sharp, and Levi's troops of roughly 150 men, they could see Carthage on the horizon as the sun lazily sunk to their right, casting long shadows to the left of the riders on their southward journey. The plan was in the works, the actors in their places on stage, for the jail attack to be a success by these conspirators. Joe's closest confidants, the Quorum of Apostles, were scattered all over the nation, preaching, and they were holding important meetings for Joe's presidential campaign. Amasa Lyman was in Cincinnati. George A. Smith, who we have to thank for the history of the church, was in Jacksonburg, Michigan. John E. Page was in Pittsburgh working on publishing a propaganda pamphlet, and he'd soon be joined by Hinchpin Rigdon, who was passing on a steamer through St. Louis right now on his way to Pittsburgh to election year as well. You see, Rigdon got out of town before the heat really turned up, just a couple days before Joe and Hyrum surrendered. Rigdon's leadership was the contingency plan if everything went south for Joe and Hyrum. Orson Hyde was in Washington, D.C., holding high-level meetings with fellow Master Masons trying to sell Joe as a viable POTUS candidate. Joe's brother, Crazy Willie Smith, was somewhere in the East, possibly in Boston, possibly New York. We don't really know. Heber the Creeper Kimball was hanging out with Lyman White, the Wild Ram in the Mountain, in Philadelphia, heading to a conference that was to be held in Boston, presided over by Bloody Brigham Young and Willie Goat Wilford Woodruff, who were already there preparing for that conference. Of all these church leaders, only Rigdon had the latest intel and had any idea of what was going on in Nauvoo. The others weren't even aware that the Nauvoo Expositor had been published, much less that the press was destroyed and that Nauvoo had been placed under martial law and the Legion was disbanded and that Joe and Hyrum were in jail while Governor Ford was there handling matters personally. Oh, Joseph and Hyrum, I regret to tell you, your die is cast, your doom is fixed, you are sentenced to be shot. Listeners, this is the moment we've all been waiting for. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.bandcamp.com and used with permission. Legal counsel is provided by Andrew Torres of the Law Offices of P. Andrew Torres and the Opening Arguments podcast. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC. Copyright 2020. All rights reserved.